Everything okay?
Yep.
Good.
All right. On the perm, the feminists attempt to obtain more power and control over a new self-monitoring regime of power turning case, Tapper 93. The first general point to be made is that these practices are playing into and extending the strategies of control that the administrators of the academies are already implementing. They also require a new kind of person, one prepared to engage in constant self-monitoring and to accept frequent external appraisal, where the criteria of acceptability as distinct from accountability and undermining the autonomy of individual academics and the processes of peer review and debate. These new procedures will establish a profile of the normal, acceptable academic and institute systems of surveillance and judgment. First, a certain kind of individual will be required, and not just one with the right statements, but also one with the right thoughts, movements, and gestures, power, says Foucault, structures and possible field of action of others, and the modern form of pastoral power does so in ways which make individuals subject to someone else by control and dependence and tied to his own identity by a conscious or self-knowledge. Foucault says, in thinking of the mechanisms of power, I am thinking it as a capillary form of existence, the point where power reaches into itself, into their actions and attitudes, their discourses, their learning processes in everyday lives. As with other areas of disciplinary power which employ exports to label us and make us conform, these new procedures will require and produce a new set of experts and a new regime of power. Relations of power require the production of discourses which involve an ensemble of rules according to which the true and the false are separated and which have the specific effects of power attached to them. Arguments from authority of feminist texts say that Plato is sexist, so he is. That logic is masculine, so it is. Women's studies research shows that multiple choice tests disadvantage females and that males and females employ different learning styles, so they do. Will certain methods of teaching and assessment be banned? We cannot claim autonomy for ourselves while denying it in others. Worse, such a denial undermines our own autonomy. If we reject the patriarchal, any discourse that is committed to truth and objectivity or any model of intellectual inquiry that requires formal logic or aims for unambiguous, precise models of articulation, then it's not clear how such feminists could conduct themselves in the academy without denying the autonomy of most of its members. The use of feminist discourse, the specific power effect it has induced, and its deployment and use in the existing structures of power in institutions is not acting as a roadblock to repression, but introduce a new form of it. And I'm sorry I forgot to send this card, I'll send it after the speech. The critique solves the case, vote neg, Lewis Call 95. Nietzsche's texts contain many possibilities for postmodern feminism because they strongly exemplify two related things that characterize so much of the postmodern feminist position: women as multiple and women as representation. The latter theme is particularly crucial given Nietzsche's views on representation and truth. If Nietzsche is right about the status of truth as metaphor, then his attempt to construct a new representation or metaphor of women can be viewed as the beginning of a radical new feminism. It might be no coincidence that the discovery of Nietzsche by feminist writers is taking place at the same time that radical political theorists, including feminists, are seeking to articulate a philosophy of otherness and difference. Nietzsche's representations of women have profound political implications. His texts simultaneously decry the failures of modernist feminism and illustrate the possibility of a feminist politics that is truly beyond the modern. First off, they can't perm because their kind of feminist politics is ressentiment. They even said that they engage in ressentiment with their action. So the links swamp the terms terms that they possibly have as an excuse for why they can perm are swamped by the fact that they advocate for a feminist politics in their plan, which is an act of ressentiment, which totally obliterates the point of arcade and the alternative, which is to affirm life. They view the plan through the lens of a feminist perspective, and what we're saying is rather you should view it through the lens of per se ressentiment and the way that Nietzsche prescribes to it. They say that, well, it's more complicated than that. On the K-Flow, they talk about their Ahmed card and how it complicates nihilism and how they can utilize ressentiment in order to fight oppression. And what we're saying is that cross-apply or extend or Daikin card is that essentially it's two sides of the same coin. By engaging in ressentiment, you are continuing the cycle of violence that will occur. Because you're engaging in that ressentiment and that violence against yourself doesn't make it any less worse. All you're doing is like what Ahab was doing, is that looking into the past, the suffering, the pain of your past, and they're grounding their actions in that suffering and their pain in the past and letting it dictate their future rather than letting it go and moving forward and solving for their own ressentiment, which will end the cycle of violence that is occurring. All they're doing is reproducing the violence that others are performing against them upon themselves through their alternative. And we're saying that the only way to disengage from ressentiment, solve for all of ressentiment, is to go through the alternative, which is to affirm life. And my partner will go into why that's not vague in her speech. But alternative is the only way into which we can possibly solve for all of ressentiment or any way in which a worldview that encompasses the solvency of ressentiment can occur because of their feminist lens through which they look at the cyborg and that whole advocacy. So we believe that we can solve for the affirmative also because as that card that I just read talked about, it will lead to a new feminist movement that will not engage in ressentiment and will end the cycle of violence, which is the only way in which we need, essentially like the Daikin card again explains that we're a prereq only through affirming life by removing ressentiment within our own lives. That is the only way in which we can move forward joyfully and happily in our lives instead of engaging in ressentiment, perpetuating the cycle of violence. Because the cycle of violence, how it's perpetuated is that, again, we have objective truths, which their affirmative clearly still supports to a certain extent, where they say that through the feminist cyborg lens, they only expand the boundaries instead of simply removing them. They still perform, they have this what they think is this objective view of the world of how feminism and patriarchy engages with people within the real world, and they think that they can change that through their plan action. They talk about how changing the binary and changing people's identities, and we're saying that it's okay if you engage in that politics yourself, but their kind of advocacy clearly is insinuating an advocacy that changes other people's lives as well, which is the will to power, which also directly links to our K. Again, the Daikin card, this will to power in the ressentiment that I was talking about before with the feminist movement is what leads to things like just wars, where people wage a war and violent actions against others that they disagree with, so they believe that they are right because they believe in this objective truth that they think is, well, they believe in this truth that they believe is to be objective. And so they're simply perpetuating cycles of violence. Extend the Daikin card and extend our Zubankik 03 card. The neg is a joyful overcoming of the sickness of guilt, and our method is not repressing. It is the refusal to nurture the pain of the past and allow it to grow in the actions of the future. So I was talking about before, by facing ressentiment head on and solving it within our own lives. That is the only way in which we can move forward in a joyful and happy way. So to answer this unitary argument, we're no more unitary than them. So if anything, the turn applies to them as well as us. But I don't think that we're really universalist. I don't really understand what the link is to this argument to our K. We do believe that ressentiment is the root cause of all violence. They didn't necessarily refute that. They just said, well, we can use ressentiment in a productive way. So we still maintain that ressentiment is the root cause, and that's our wood card. And why that is because people are constantly securitizing themselves from others, things that they see as evil, foreign, and something they don't understand. And so they react against it. They securitize themselves from it in various ways, whether that's violent action or simply creating binaries and boundaries as they talk about in their affirmative, which is also an ontological violence as they talk about, which is the way by solving ressentiment through our affirmative and our alternative. That is the only way in which we can solve for those boundaries and completely remove them and allow people of all individuals to create their own spaces, which I believe is the most productive and the best way to go about solving the problem that the affirmative went over. So again, we solve for the affirmative the best, and we also solve for the K. They can do neither.
Okay, so when you say feminism, what do you mean?
The movement of feminism.
Yes, but what does that mean?
I don't quite. Are you asking me to define what feminism is, or who is part of the movement?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, because you're talking about our app as the feminist movement, I just want to know, the way that you see our app.
So the way I see your app is that you're incorporating a feminist lens to the cyborg, right? Are you advocating for a feminist cyborg politics?
And how does that link to the case term?
So what we're saying is that feminism is a universal view of the world, this objective truth, and it's a ressentiment to a certain extent by looking at this patriarchy, this overbearing oppression, this masculinity, for example, and instead of going about it in a more constructive and joyful manner, it's more of a movement of ressentiment, a reaction against it that is alienating those that are not necessarily part of the feminist movement.
What is a joyful overcoming of guilt?
A joyful overcoming of guilt would be to face one's own ressentiment and to disengage from it within your own life.
And how do you do that?
You would do that by not viewing pain and suffering as something you should securitize yourself from.
And how does the app securitize ourselves from pain and suffering?
By performing ressentiment against yourself. That's your solvency, is that.
So enacting violence against ourselves is securitizing ourselves from that violence?
Yes.
Okay.
Ressentiment is an act of securitization. Just because you're performing violent acts against yourself doesn't make it any less worse.
Okay. How does your alternative solve our case?
So the alternative solves the case by addressing ressentiment. If you address ressentiment, eventually what would happen is that things like the
How
boundaries.
does addressing ressentiment stop people from violently acting out against my partner when he doesn't perform a man?
What?
He doesn't perform a man.
So what would happen is that, like you were talking about, if people weren't, by disengaging from ressentiment, you're ending the cycle.
Right, I'm saying somebody who physically kicks my partner because he wants to dress like a woman, how does embracing your advocacy stop that from happening?
Okay, so by disengaging from ressentiment, eventually what happens is that people no longer view you as something to securitize themselves against.
So my partner should just let people pick him?
No.
No. We're saying that people would learn to see that he is no different than they are.
Because ressentiment is the root cause of their actions.